And you're next. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd like to start out by echoing some of your comments. You know, it always amazes me in these tragedies that we see the absolute best in America. I mean, I will never forget the pictures of the determined faces of the firemen, the police officers in 9/11 walking up those stairs. And we saw the exact same thing in Boston. When those bombs went off, rather than running away from danger, we saw the citizens of Boston run toward the danger to help out. And it's, first of all, I want to thank all of those that responded. I want to thank you for your testimony. So it is truly remarkable. Dr. Kellerman, I truly appreciated your testimony and your comments that this really is a state and local, primarily, responsibility. So based on that, first of all, Commissioner Davis, I'm a numbers guy. What percent of your budget comes from the federal government, from the state government, from the local government? Just to kind of get, do you have a general sense of that?
Senator, our budget is primarily a local budget. We have about a 10% increase in our budget that comes from federal and state grants. It's primarily, the state grants are usually pass-throughs from federal. So most of that money, most of that 10% of my budget is coming from the federal government.
Okay, so about 90%. Mr. Schwartz, in terms of your agency and the state, how much is from the state coffers versus the federal government?
Excuse me. Well, the State Emergency Management Agency, as an agency, is about 50% funded through federal grant dollars, and much of that is emergency management performance grant dollars. The numbers across our other key state agencies, if you looked at fire services, state police, are much, infinitely smaller than that because they're receiving project-specific grants.
So in terms of responding really to this Boston City bombing, just kind of putting the numbers together, 90% is local, plus then that 10%, 50% of that 10% for 5% is state, and you got 50% of that coming from the state. So about 92.5% is really state and local government funding, which underscores your point, Dr. Kellerman, that 7.5% is federal government spending, 92.5% is state and local. So with that in light, because being prepared is incredibly important, we've certainly, I guess, Commissioner Davis, the question I'd have to ask you is how many cities have contacted Boston based on your extraordinary response to this to get some tips, some pointers, get some training from what you've done right?
There have been dozens of cities within the United States and dozens of cities outside the United States that have contacted us to share best practices with them.
Now, we've seen an awful lot of abuse here in the federal government level of conferences and association meetings, but here's a real valid use of them. And is it being used that way? Do you have national associations that are getting together where when you get similar commissioners or you've got public safety officials coming together for training, for sharing stories, for sharing best practices? And how often does that happen?
We do. About once a year, there are groups of us that travel to different countries. I'm headed to the Middle East this year. I was there last year. In 2005, I traveled to London and worked with Sir Ian Blair just after the tube bombings, and he was able to lay out precisely what the Metropolitan Police did in response to the terrorist attack in the London tube. That information was extremely valuable to me when I arrived on the scene. When I got there, it can be overwhelming to see the kind of carnage that was wrought on the city of Boston. But because I had been to London and spoken to people who have put the case together, I knew precisely the process to follow.
Were there other U.S. city commissioners, police commissioners that went with you to London?
There were.
How many?
There were 6 of us that traveled over there in 2005. There were 3 of us that traveled to the Middle East last year. That's largely through the Police Executive Research Forum, and they do use federal money to allow some of those trips. So it is working, but I think it should be expanded, especially with this threat of terrorism that's international.
But again, from my standpoint, wouldn't it be just as efficient to hold those conferences here in the U.S. and have similar types of conferences occurred?
However it works, absolutely.
But I mean, have those conferences occurred, or are they scheduled to occur?
They have occurred. We've brought people from the country of Israel. We've brought people from India. There have been people that have come to our national conferences to give presentations, including the UK.
Okay, Dr. Kellerman, real quick, what other cities are performing at Boston's level?
I think the major terrorist cities are at or close to that level: New York City, Los Angeles, but others that I think have got to raise their game, have got to take this seriously. The fact that around this country today, the most critical arena of patient care in any hospital and disaster, the emergency room, is the most congested arena in the hospital is unconscionable. Israel, which is a country I admire in their no-nonsense, straightforward, practical approach to preparedness, that's the last place in the hospital they allow to get backed up. We have to change that philosophy in this country.
Okay. My time's running short, so I have to get into the Mirandizing issue. Commissioner Davis, what were your thoughts when Johar Tsarnaev was Mirandized within how many hours? 16 hours? Well, I can't remember the exact time frame.
Right. We received an order from the United States Attorney's Office not to Mirandize anyone in connection with this incident because it was being prosecuted at the federal level. And I was surprised, but these statutes are passed here, and they are implemented by the United States Attorney, and we take direction from the people who are in charge. At that point in time, the FBI had taken over the investigation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was running the investigative part of it. And so I considered that an order from the people who were statutorily responsible for this investigation. But it was a surprise to me, Senator.
Okay, I meant 60 hours, not 16 hours. There's no hard and fast rule in terms of when that Mirandizing occurs, correct?
Correct.
And we've actually there have been instances, precedents, where that's gone on for 7 days.
I'm not aware
or beyond.
of that.
Do you think that would have been the appropriate thing to do in this case? Hold off Mirandizing Johar before, to actually get more information?
In this particular case, no. I think that Miranda would have been fine, but I can see we did have an evolving threat for a period of time after those bombs were thrown, and I can see that there can be unfolding situations where it might not be appropriate. So I don't want to comment.
It is true that he stopped talking the moment he was Mirandized, correct?
Yes.
We got no further information.
As far as I know.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mr.